The CTV is under fire after platforming the head of the Khalistani movement, Sikhs for Justice.
After a wave of Class 1 truck driver accidents, Alberta is, quote, closing the loophole, which allowed commercial truck drivers to wreck a truck at one company and begin driving for another with a blank record.
A new study found that over 23,500 patients have died while waiting to access both critical and non-essential healthcare services last year. Hello Canada, it's Thursday, November 27th, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Cosmin, Dzsurdsza.
And I'm Clayton, DeMaine.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. CTV News is under fire for giving a platform to Gurpatwant Singh Panun, a prominent Khalistani activist and the head of Sikhs for Justice.
PM Khalistani government has effectively surrendered the sovereignty of Canada to Modi's India regime, which, as per their own intelligence agencies, is responsible for orchestrating the assassination of Shaheed Hardeep Singh Nijjar, ongoing assassination plots and the extortions, and the Indian consulates being used as the intelligence and spy network hub. And what I want to add is that with the PM Khalistani government in minority, neither do they have a mandate or parliament strength to move forward with any trade agreement with India.
Panun, an American-based activist and lawyer, is general counsel for Sikhs for Justice and has led diaspora-based Khalistan campaigns for over a decade. He is considered one of the most prominent international organizers behind a series of non-binding, quote, referendums advocating for an independent Sikh homeland. Panun has also drawn scrutiny from security agencies. 2023, both the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and the RCMP opened investigations after he issued videos invoking the 1985 Air India bombing and made other public threats. Canadian officials described the rhetoric as extremist and linked to potential security concerns. The Khalistan movement's history in Canada includes the Air India Flight 182 bombing, which killed 329 people, most of them Canadian citizens, and remains the deadliest terrorist attack in Canadian history. During the CTV interview, Panun appeared with anti-Hindu slogans, which prompted objections from Hindu community groups. So, Clayton, this guy has been pretty active in the Khalistani movement in Canada particularly, but the Khalistan movement stretches beyond Canada's borders. Obviously, it is an independence movement hoping to create a separatist state in the Punjab region of India. So you've followed Panun, you've written about him before. I believe you may have even interviewed him. What do we know about Panun for those who are not familiar with him and his background?
Yeah, absolutely. So True North has spoken to Panun several times now, and the first time I spoke to him, it was clear that India would likely consider him a terrorist. So I asked him if that's the case, and sure enough, India had designated Panun as a, quote, individual terrorist in 2020 and banned his movement, Sikhs for Justice, as being, quote, an unlawful association in 2019. Now, Canada hasn't done that. And the Indian government claims that Panun and the SFJ have maintained relations with other Sikh groups, which it has already banned, including a group known as Babar Khalsa International, which Canada has also formally listed as a terrorist entity. But this gentleman has been at the heart of many controversial Sikh activist protests over the last couple of years in Canada, including protests in Calgary during the G7 summit, which featured Indian politicians in the crosshairs of guns and chants of people calling to kill Modi, and then followed by the word politics. Other chants at the protest included individuals calling to ambush Modi, similarly adding politics at the end, which reminds me of a trend online where people say something that they would never be able to say publicly and cap it off with the phrase "in Minecraft" to cover their violent or otherwise criminal rhetoric. The group has also chanted things such as Parmar's ideologies is ours to guide, referencing a Sikh activist accused of taking part in that Montreal Air India bombing in 1985, which, as you read out, was the deadliest terrorist attack on Canadian soil to date. And Panin also was on the record offering an $11,000 reward for information on what flight the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was departing Canada from, though he later said this was just so that activists could deliver an effigy of Modi's corpse to him. Every time True North asks him about these incidents, however, he always states that these sorts of activities are to be done as part of a, quote, peaceful protest. Alberta is acting after a wave of high-profile crashes involving Class 1 truck drivers across North America that have shaken public confidence in the industry. Recent tragedies, including the widely reported Florida case where a tractor-trailer attempted a U-turn across a highway and killed an entire family, have brought the issue into headlines and cabinet discussions. Albertans have watched similar near misses, jackknives, infrastructure strikes, and serious collisions on provincial highways and want to know why unsafe operators keep getting back behind the wheel. The province is now closing the loophole that allowed some drivers to wreck a truck at one company and walk into another with no record of their past performance. The new requirement forces carriers to provide a standardized driver experience record whenever a Class 1 operator changes jobs. The government says this creates real accountability because the driver's history follows the driver instead of staying hidden in a company file. Transportation Minister Devin Dzsurdsza says the province has heard repeated complaints about dangerous drivers continuing to circulate through the system. Dzsurdsza said, quote, "We've seen cases where bad drivers bounce from one company to another after an accident, leaving the next employer in the dark. It's not widespread, but even one reckless driver can put lives at risk. That's why we're making sure a driver's record follows them, so the good drivers are rewarded and the bad ones are held accountable." So, Cosmin, here in the GTA and in the Toronto area, I hear from people all the time now concerned about when we're passing trucks on the highway. I hear it from parents. I hear it from a lot of people around here. How widespread is this issue of truck driving accidents? And what is at the root of this apparent surge in truck accidents in Canada?
Yeah, Clayton, it's a bigger deal than I think the legacy media recognizes. You do hear about these high-profile crashes, like the recent tragedy in Florida where that tractor trailer tried to make the illegal U-turn and killed an entire family. And it's easy to look at that and think this is a one-off freak accident, horrible incident. But the reality is, close calls and near misses have been happening across North America more often than the public sees. I mean, here in British Columbia, you often hear about trucks hitting overpasses. And it doesn't take a stretch of the imagination to see when you're traveling at high speeds, something like that turning into a far worse disaster that could potentially involve casualties. So these incidents aren't rare, and they're showing up on our highways with an alarming regularity now. And part of the reason is because drivers are simply not meeting the standards we had in place, and this is a systemic issue. So for years, there's been this loophole, as pointed out by the Alberta legislation, where a driver could crash and then essentially start fresh. And with this loophole, your record doesn't actually follow you for your past performance. So companies and insurers don't have reliable ways to track the driver's safety history. So when you have bad operators who want to leave their past behind and potentially keep a job. They just move to a new company and they can keep circulating through that system over and over again every time they get into a crash because companies are more than happy at the current moment to take on new drivers. And unfortunately, that puts everyone else on the road at risk. So really the root of the surge is a mix of a few things, including the gaps in oversight, inconsistent training standards, or at least training standards that aren't actually met, where people cheat and game the system, and just a general lack of transparency across the industry where employers can check the background and driving history that drivers carry with them. Over 23,500 patients died in Canada while waiting for surgeries or diagnostic scans, according to a new study by secondstreet.org. The free market think tank says the death toll is underreported due to several provinces' failure to track the data. Despite the organization's request for information, Second Street released its fifth annual died on a waiting list report on Wednesday, showing that the number of Canadians dying while waiting for both critical and non-essential care has increased, saying the quote, overall situation has in fact deteriorated from last year. The think tank began submitting Freedom of Information requests to gather government data on the number of Canadians dying while waiting for surgeries and diagnostic scans since 2018. Second Street sent out requests to quote over 40 government health departments, health authorities, and regions in April 2025 and discovered that at least 23,746 patients died while waiting for care in the fiscal year 2024-2025. Last year's waitlist deaths represent a 31.74% increase from the year prior's data. However, Second Street notes that such an increase could be expected as more government agencies began providing data to the group's annual study. Colin Craig, the president of the think tank and author of the report, noted that when comparing just the data from the healthcare bodies that provided information to the group in the report from the fiscal year 2023-2024, there was still a 3% increase in waitlist deaths. Since April 2018, when the data was first requested, Second Street has confirmed more than 100,800 Canadians have died while waiting to access healthcare in Canada. The group notes that these deaths are not due to a lack of funding, as Canada has consistently been one of the highest spenders on healthcare among other developed universal healthcare systems globally. So, Clayton, obviously the problem is bad. It's not getting any better. It's getting worse in reality. But what are some recommendations that have been proposed to fix these long wait times?
Yeah, so Second Street recommended 5 ways that Canadian healthcare systems can address the issue. They noted, firstly, that Canadian healthcare providers could begin tracking and disclosing any relevant data on waitlist deaths, including what kind of services they died waiting for, so Canadians can have a more accurate look at how to address the problem rather than waiting for freedom of information requests from a charity to disclose the information. They also recommended funding healthcare providers based on the services that they provide, or, quote, activity based funding, rather than annual checks to cover entire budgets. They said if healthcare providers have to rely on actually providing the services to get funding, it would incentivize them to maximize the amount of surgeries or diagnostics that they conduct in a year rather than just getting money regardless of how they perform. It would likely also mean they are incentivized to use the funding dollars in a way that maximizes the amount of care they give. The think tank also recommended that Canada learn from the other universal healthcare systems, which rank higher in providing healthcare services, such as a hybrid partnership with the private sector. And the group suggested that allowing a private clinic to bill the government for the healthcare visit, like other nations do, doesn't take away from the fact that government is still paying for those medical visits. And they say by expanding the service to the private sector, it would alleviate the workload from the public healthcare system. Second Street also recommended that governments expand healthcare options to allow non-governmental clinics to provide the same services that clinics which patients are often leaving Canada to access do. The think tank also argued for the federal government to adopt a, quote, EU cross-border directive style approach, which would allow patients in one province to travel to another to access healthcare while still being reimbursed by their home province's government. And the province would cover up to the same amount that the government would have spent to provide the surgery or diagnostic in their province. They say that this would reduce waitlist numbers as patients who use the service would immediately be removed from the waitlists in their own province, meaning others waiting for care would move up on the waitlist each time someone ahead of them chose to travel for healthcare. They say that this would reduce waitlist numbers as patients who use the service would immediately be removed from the waitlist in their own province, meaning others waiting for care would move up on the waitlist each time someone ahead of them chose to travel for healthcare.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.